America's involvement in Vietnam began in 1954, when a political treaty divides the country in two. Communist China and the Soviet Union support the North, while the United States backs the South. Fearing the spread of communism throughout the region, Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson provide South Vietnam with military and financial assistance. By the spring of 1964, Vietnam is becoming a hotspot in the Cold War. More than 16,000 U.S. advisors are training South Vietnam's army to battle a homegrown guerrilla force known as the Viet Cong, or VC. With the support of the North, the VC are working to overthrow the South Vietnamese government and reunite the country under communist rule. But what has been primarily a civil war is about to change.
The first time was 1965. It was August of '65, up to my 25th birthday. And there was only about 35,000 GIs in Vietnam at that time. In fact, I remember how surprised I was. We landed at Tan Son Nhut Air Force. We went up, and the sergeant says, "Okay, go get a taxi, go downtown, and get yourself a hotel." You know. And sure enough, we went down, and we got a fleet back of a hotel called the Saigon Inn or something. But eventually, I ended up staying up at a hotel downtown Saigon that was run by a Chinese man and run by a bunch of Chinese teenagers. Had a sign outside, "No Vietnamese allowed," and actually had somewhat of an enjoyable time. I mean, we were able to be with the economy. I understood the seriousness of the war. Don't get me wrong, and I did not take that lightly. But I lived on the economy. We had some great French food and what have you. And then the second time I told you, I came back at the following year, and that was down in the Mekong Delta. The city, the capital was called Canton. The air base that I was Binh Thuy. There was also a Green Beret air base, and there was a Navy air base in close proximity. But there I was there for 9 months, and there I was the base intelligence officer, making sure the base commander and the pilots were properly briefed as to what the dangers were and what happened. Oh, I was very supportive of the war. In fact, I went over the first time, by assignment. I was at March Air Force Base, and they needed an airman, intelligence officer who would be able to annotate photographs for bombing missions. When jets, when they go over bombing missions, they don't just, drop bombs hit another. They have photographs in their cockpit, with the buildings annotated and where the, anti-aircraft, guns might be, and the surface of the air missiles. And so they would have a photograph in their cockpit that usually no more than 24 hours old. And in my first job in Vietnam, we'd be there getting the photographs and annotating them and getting prepared for the Air Force officers and their strikes in North Vietnam. Then I came back after 3 months, back to March Air Force Base, and then they sent me over to Bangor, Maine to be a bomber intelligence officer up there. A very, very boring job. So the first thing I did was volunteer to go back to Vietnam, because there's a war going on. If you're in the military, get there. Remember, I'm not an infantryman. I'm not being shot at. I'm an Air Force intelligence officer. So I did some pulling some strings of persuasion, a letter writing. So I was sent back to Vietnam, and they stationed me again in Saigon. But then I again politics a little bit and got myself down to the Mekong Delta, where I was the base intelligence officer. But I was very supportive of the war during the war, and very supportive of the war for the most part after the war, and which is what got me involved in politics. Was the war in Vietnam. You got to remember, back then the Army was the only service that drafted.
Okay, so.
And if you got drafted, you only had to spend 2 years. If you volunteered, you had to spend 4 years. If you got drafted into the Army, they didn't send you to intelligence school, you got the artillery, you got the infantry, or you became the cook or something like that, but if you volunteered, then of course you volunteered to the service you want, and more often than not you had to volunteer what field you wanted to go into, but for some reason when I went into the Air Force, they sent me to Armed Forces Air Intelligence School, and I became an intelligence officer. And I was in the service for quite a while before. When I was first in the Air Force, there was no war in Vietnam. We always talked about the war in Laos. And so there were no real ground troops. That was the first time I went over. There was only 35,000. Now, when I came back a year later, there were 250 American GIs that were in Vietnam at the time. Not any more than I guess you all would be today would be talking about what's going on in Crimea, or you know, we certainly would be discussing it. I remember we were thinking that there'd be no need for tanks or conventional, military because of the terrain would not allow it. And we talked about it, but none of us ever thought we'd be sent over there. Well, the first one I would just say it was routine. I had a commission. I was a lieutenant, but the job was very routine. Annotating photographs, not the most exciting job in the world. Most of the excitement was the off hours when we would be down in Saigon. Now, in the Mekong Delta, that was a very serious. I was the base intelligence officer. In fact, at one time, because of the information I got, I probably predicted that the base was going to be a Christmas recess. And I predicted, I said, I believe we're going to be attacked, sometime, before the Christmas recess, which was going to be like midnight after Christmas Eve. And people started harassing me as the base wasn't attacked. And I remember they walked in, it was Christmas Eve, and I said, well, where's this attack? Well, it was right at midnight, the base was attacked, but the pilots were quite prepared because I briefed them on that. And they were really in action, and very little damage was done on that attack. But my job was to keep them informed. We had over 200,000 Viet Congs throughout the Mekong Delta surrounding us, and Cam To was secure. Again, in Vietnam it was very interesting. Unlike the Iraqi war, where everybody was scared dead to go outside their compound, I had no trouble walking around Cam To. I had no trouble walking around Saigon. I lived in downtown Cam To, with other GIs. And same way in Saigon, we felt very secure. It was only when we got outside the parameters that, you better be careful.